Welcome to Real World, Real Talk with Dr. D.Z. Cofield. The show represents captivating conversations and insightful information to encourage and inspire you with all you need to become the best you can possibly be. And now, your host for Real World, Real Talk, Dr. D.Z. Cofield.
Welcome to Real World, Real Talk. I'm your host, Dr. D.Z. Cofield, Senior Pastor at the Good Hope Missionary Baptist Church in Houston, Texas. And I want to thank you for being with me on your member-supported radio station. I want to thank you for being part of what promises to be a historic show as we give you a glimpse behind the curtain of what pastors are dealing with. That's right, pastors. Those people that we look at as spiritual supermen and superwomen. We see our church leaders as people who are just above the standard of regular living. But the truth is, many of them are suffering some of the same things that you're suffering and dealing with it while dealing with your stuff as well. And as we approach Pastors Appreciation Month in the month of October, I thought it would be good for us to talk today about this subject. And we're going to look at a very, very powerful book, a book that is filled with transparency, filled with vulnerability, to give you some insight into some of the things that your pastoral leadership may be dealing with them, how to pray for them, how to encourage them, how to love them. We want to help you to do that on our show today. Now, just a couple of housekeeping matters before we get started. If you'd like to follow me during the week, you can follow me on IG at DZ Cofield. You can follow me on Facebook at DZ Cofield. And you can follow me on Twitter at, you guessed it, DZ Cofield. Dr. Larry Anderson is the impetus behind this work. And he tells a powerful story of receiving a phone call, getting the news about a pastor who had committed suicide, wondering and thinking to himself, how could a person so close to God, who's helping other people get close to God, how could they take their own life? But the truth of the matter is that was more a norm than we really wanted to admit. And there are thousands and thousands of pastors across this country who are dealing with depression, who are addressing their depression sometimes in unhealthy ways. And we want to talk about that on today. Larry Anderson really pulled a group of pastors together to talk about this. And I've got three with me on tonight. Let me welcome these brothers to Real World, Real Talk. First of all, Dr. Larry Anderson, Pastor Ricky Wilson, and Pastor Paul James are with me in the virtual studio on tonight. Brothers, how are y'all doing?
Doing well, sir.
So I need to tell everybody in full disclosure, some of these brothers, man, I've known for many years. And before I started pastoring, way back in the year of our Lord, I mean, when we were associate ministers and serving on campuses and things like that. And, you know, it's amazing as time has gone by, how God has moved in each of our ministries. And Dr. Larry Anderson brought this really subject, I think, to the forefront and created this seminal work. I believe it's going to be a seminal work, giving us a look into the life of pastors. Dr. Anderson, thank you for being with us on tonight on Real World, Real Talk. Talk about your journey and how this book was really given birth to.
Well, first, thanks for having me. My journey, I've been serving as the pastor of Great Commission Church in Philadelphia, urban Philadelphia, for 18 years. I also serve as the director of church health for the Baptist Resource Network, overseeing 350 churches in Pennsylvania and South Jersey, as well as served as a professor at Missionary here located in Philadelphia. So my life over the last couple of decades have been either pastoring or working directly with current and future pastors. And so I'm intimately connected with those who serve in this office. And so I'm aware of the pain and the perils that goes along with it. Many times we only see a praise side of it, and we see the preaching side of it, but we don't see the intimate look behind the pulpit. And it was that connection, those relationships, that brokenness, the suicide reports, the self-sabotaging that was taking place, that really forced me to say, hey, this has to be addressed. This need to be brought out into the forefront. We have some wounded warriors, but they're wounded and they're trying to help others when the truth is they need some help themselves. And the unfortunate thing is when you're in a position such as pastor and you need help, many people look down on you and they think you're not spiritual enough or something wrong with you. And so we fear being transparent or be looked against us. We fear coming out and getting help. That could put our job and our credibility in jeopardy when we do those things. And so we often suffer in silence. And I felt that this was time to say something to stop the trajectory of suicide and self-sabotage.
You said something that was very interesting. You said pastors have been willing to share their problems with each other, but they haven't been willing to share their pain. And I thought that was so profound and so revealing, because I find the same thing, right? We can talk about our common problems, but we don't talk about our pain. And I think part of that is tied to exactly what you're saying. And that's the whole idea of, whether or not we're going to be transparent as pastors. We have this air of perfection about us. We're the ones that are standing and preaching and teaching the truth. I'm not sure how much of that is also tied to us being men, because we're not real revealing of our health and our intimate issues as men. I'm dealing with some things 60, and I'm like, man, my dad, my grandfather, they never told me stuff was going to change. You know what I mean? When you crossed over, boy, and so I'm dealing with stuff now, and I'm having those conversations with my son. I'm like, okay, just keep on living. I'm telling my two sons, man, because, this thing, starts shifting on you. Paul James, what intrigued you about this project when Larry Anderson contacted you?
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Cofield, for having me on. It's a pleasure to be with you. You are my former nemesis on the court of basketball, and we always had amiable battles back in the day in Philadelphia. So it's just good to see you. You were innovative then, you still are now. What intrigued me is my own journey as a third generation pastor, and being in the inner sanctum of pastors in pastors' studies, being with my dad on his preaching engagements. I had a very unique vantage point, a kind of front row seat in seeing some of the things that pastors go through. And I also understand my friend, Dr. Anderson, that if he has a burden on his heart, the dimension of this one, that we need to write a book of self-disclosure and tell them the real deal about what is going on in our private lives as pastors. I knew that had to be a move of God, in that he's a sober man and isn't just looking for another thing to do. And I could hear the conviction in what he said to me, what he wrote to me, and it immediately clicked inside of me. And then my own struggles and my own journey of what I was going through at the time during an international pandemic. So it resonated based on my history and also based on the current things that were unfolding in my life as a pastor in global pandemic.
Pastor Ricky Wilson, you're godfather to my two sons, man. You and your lovely wife, Shirley, and your boys and my boys grew up together playing down at Dallas Seminary while we were fooling around with Hopox legomenons and superlapsarianism. So we go way back, even before that, before either one of us were married, back to your days at Cheney State and my days at Swarthmore College. What moved you to get involved in this project?
All right. Thank you, my friend, Dr. Cofield. Appreciate you. And I thank God for what he's doing with you, not only in your state, your country, and in the world. So God bless you and thank you. And I want to thank Dr. Anderson for including me. When he shared this, it caused me to pause, because the the thing that was scary about it was, every pastor has his journey. The scary thing for me was, oh, people going to know what was going on the inside. That was a scary thing for me. It was scary, painful, and I had to kind of check my pride on that, because how people going to know how to pray if they don't know what's going on? You know how we say to the members, I didn't know this, so I'm going to pray. Well, you kind of have to look into the mirror. They probably are functioning a little bit based on how their pastor is. And so when I had to face a number of things, and I just wanted to talk about what was most close to me, and it caused me almost to go and have therapy on myself. And it had me asking questions, had me revisiting, dealing with emotions that I did not allow myself or give myself permission to feel, because you're the pastor. And as a pastor, this is what a pastor ought to look like. This is what a pastor ought to do. And because I went through that journey, at one time, I was thinking a little bit, hey, I'm going through this puppy by myself. But in reality, when the Lord brought this to Dr. Anderson's attention, it was evident it was God, because every pastor has their journey, but we all have not talked about our journey in such a way where people can understand that the pastor's not asking for pity, but the pastor's saying, just want you to know how life is for us. And not to put us somewhere where we should not be, because it causes them to treat a certain way. But I found it very eye-opening, revealing, and even today I'm still having to say, stay transparent, because you're helping the people to see the man. It goes back to what you and I remember Dr. E.K. Bailey used to say to us. It's easier for the people to forgive a man than it is to forgive a God. And so that still resonates. And so, and I just have to keep that in mind. But this was a challenge, and I really appreciate the opportunity to be a part of it.
Yeah, a pastor here in Houston went through a very, very public, shameful scandal. And I had breakfast with one of our white evangelical leaders right afterwards. And I knew that it was going to come up, of course, because the pastor was African-American. And, he asked me, what did I think about it? How did I feel about it? And I said to him, I said, well, man, it was such a difficult space. And I wouldn't wish that on my worst enemy, just the challenge that this pastor was going through. And I was covering him in prayer. And then I asked him what he thought about it. And, all of us are familiar with white evangelicals. And so I really expected him to lower the hammer. I mean, I really did. And he said, DZ, he said, I've learned in life, everybody has a private side that they don't want to be made public. And I said, we didn't talk anymore about it after that. We moved to the next subject. But that answer, really, I was reminded of that as I was looking at the description of the book, the reviews and excerpts and things like that. Dr. Anderson, let's talk a little bit about what you got from these pastors. You have this vision. You could have just written about your story, but you felt it was necessary to hear from other pastors. What did you get from these other pastors? Maybe that surprised you, maybe that blessed you. I don't know if you read any of them and went, whoa, that's a little too much. I didn't expect you to be that transparent. I mean, what were your feelings as you were hearing from these pastors and you were looking at the offerings that they presented to you?
Well, I really didn't want it to be just me. That was important for me. I had a book deal on the table with InterVarsity, and they, or maybe I shouldn't say the name, but they wanted me just to write the book. And I really felt it was important to hear other voices, to hear other experiences. I think what really surprised me is that how I related to so many of them that came in. when I asked those who wrote to write, I sent them a snapshot of what I was writing to let them know I'm being transparent. And so if they weren't willing to expose themselves and be naked upon those who are going to receive the book, then this wasn't the one for them. And so I appreciated what I received. I realized that others felt a sense of abandonment. Others felt hurt. Others had some unresolved conflict in their lives. Others did not reach levels that they thought they were going to reach. Individuals battled with pride and had power battles, just like I have had in my life and in my ministry. And so I saw that what we are dealing with, although because we deal with it in isolation and many times in silence, we think it's just us, and we think that the whole world is coming down on us. And if we just opened up, we would realize, and I believe as pastors read this, they're gonna be like, wow, they're going to hear a story and be like, that's me, that's mine, that's what I'm dealing with, that's what I dealt with. And it's meant to let you know you're not alone in this thing. You're not the only one who's dealing with this. And so understand that it is a burden, but it's one that we are called to carry with one another and bear with one another. And I also just felt that what we were sharing was not just therapeutic for us to write and encouraging for other pastors to read, but the majority of responses I've been getting has been from the body of Christ, who has shared they had no idea that we experienced the things that has been shared. And so you got guys who have lost their marriages, guys who have lost children, guys who have just had ministries that's failed, and they have stood and tried to be faithful in spite of. And we didn't get to counseling. We didn't take a pause. I battled cancer twice during these 18 years, and I continue to move forward with this because we've all felt this responsibility that we have. We have to stand up. We have to be strong, almost like we have to be superhuman and to do this. And I realize that that's not helping any of us by pretending to be that way or even trying to be that way. We need to know that we can rest in God and share with one another and lift one another up and take sabbaticals and not feel that that means that we are weak in any way. In fact, I think you're strong when you admit that you have a weakness.
Let's talk a little bit about the statement that you made about members being really blessed by this and the body of Christ. I was reading and was really blown away by some of the reviews. I mean, people saying, man, they started reading, had no idea how they were being impacted by it until somebody brought them a tissue because, they were crying while they were reading and didn't even realize it. Somebody else, talking about starting the book in the morning and reading it all day, couldn't put it down. How do you see this book blessing the body of Christ? And I'm talking about the non-pastors. We'll talk about pastors in just for a moment, because I can only imagine how cathartic it was. And I want to hear from all of you about the healing even of writing and putting down your thoughts and your feelings on paper, because I can imagine there's some who would be, reading this and saying, man, I wish I need to write my own story, even if nobody sees it. I need to put it down. But Dr. Anderson, talk about how this has blessed people to see pastors in a different way.
Well, again, the reviews that you've seen, most of them are public. They're on Amazon and Barnes and Noble and Westboro, the sites that the book is being sold on. I've gotten texts, emails, phone calls, and there has been a lot of weeping. There's been a lot of apologies given.
Really?
Not realized. Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, I lost my mom while I was doing this, and just the things that I went through. Every time, and I shared, every time I do somebody's mom funeral, I think about my own mom. Dealing with cancer. Every time I was doing somebody's funeral, I was thinking about who's going to do my eulogy. Losing a child myself, I didn't come to grips with that until I was writing this book. I never even actually admitted that to myself, that it even happened, because the child was stillborn, and so I didn't acknowledge it until I was going through it. But I did know every time I did a funeral of a young person, I thought about that, and so there's a pain that we delay, a grief that we delay, a kind of a mental hoarding of compartmentalizing all of our stuff, and then still trying to function, trying to encourage you and love on you. And so the apologies came from people saying, wow, I was mad when you didn't make it to this, or you didn't do that, or I left because of this, or I left because of that. And never once did I pray for you. Never once did I think about what you were going through. These are comments that I'm getting from individuals like, wow, I did not know the pain. And then I'm getting comments from other people who wrote in the book, like, I didn't know my pastor dealt with that. When we had an actual reception and folks apologized at the pastor's, at the altar's reception. Somebody said, I just want to stop and apologize right now to my pastor, after reading the book. So there's been an education. And I think part of it is our fault because we've never, we don't complain, we don't gripe, we can't say it from the pulpit. We can't complain about our people to our people, So it's like they have not heard, or they don't know really what we deal with, because we've done such a good job, if you will, and I mean that in an ironic way, of masking our own pain. And because we did that, thinking that we're standing up and we're being super spiritual, the reality is they don't know how we hurt or how they have actually hurt us. And that's being revealed throughout this book.
Yeah.
I think in a classy way, not in a gripe way, but in a classy, experiential way.
Pastor Paul James, talk to us about how you have viewed this. And I'm sitting there thinking now, man, I don't know, I guess you almost should buy a copy for every member. Like just hand it out, right? Start with whatever group you have, pastors, deacons, trustees, and just, pass it out to everybody. What has been the response of your congregants to this? Now, I know you're a straightforward guy, man. So, you take no tea for the fever, as the old folk would say. But what was the response of your congregants as they read your story?
Yeah, I build it in the 2 chapters that I wrote. I build that there are things you will learn about me that you have never heard me say. I really heard the heart of our lead compiler and author in Dr. Anderson, that we needed to be naked. We needed to be relevant and true to ourselves and what happened to us. So I think that we sometimes relate to Jesus in his divinity, but not necessarily in his humanity. And one of his names, Emmanuel, is God with us. And I think that as pastors, we kind of live up to this unrealistic standard, and we isolate ourselves. And we are Academy Award winning actors in showing forth strength and competency and wisdom. And so my church has responded very enthusiastically. They've been proud, I think, of me because they've been waiting for me to write. This has been a marvelous opportunity for me to kind of dip my toe in the water and go through some of this process with Dr. Anderson. And because writing, I think, is a big part of my future, and being a scribe, there are some things that I think I'm supposed to say prophetically. You talk about me not taking tea for the fever. My truthfulness, I think, is probably best served in some sense in the written medium more so than the spoken medium. So my church has been overwhelmingly enthusiastic. I've had 2 book signings in successive weeks and have had great sales. And I've signed a message and my name in every member's book, whether they bought it directly from myself or through a third-party retailer. And so it's been an overwhelming response. My mother loved the book and is loving the book and loved my contribution. She was featured in some of it because I told some of my backstory concerning the pressure of being a pastor that really came from some of the dysfunctional proportions of my own family life. And which is another thing that I think a lot of our pain and a lot of the factors that led a lot of us as pastors into the ministry was not from an idyllic background, but a lot of times because of dysfunction and pain or the vacuum of people like us in our own lives. So there's been a tremendous response in my community to this project.
Yeah. Pastor Ricky Wilson.
Yes, sir. Well, for me, we just did a book signing this past Sunday, and but one of the things that have been happening of the members who had purchased the book beforehand came up and said, wow, they can't put the book down. Some have shared some experiences to say they're learning how to pray for my pastor. One gentleman actually called me up and said, Pastor, I'm a safe place for you. I'm a safe place for you. I said, whoa. And this is all coming from reading the book. The only thing that I got a problem with Dr. Anderson, he should have listened to the Lord a long time ago, and then this would have made a whole different, thing going. But it was good. And one of the things for me when writing, having to relive an experience, man, that caused this big old boy to cry like a baby. And it was such a painful deal. And on top of that, after, crying and, I know there was so many words we were given a limit to. I just wrote everything that came to mind, how I felt about it and everything. And I had just, I said, I got to get up from this desk now. And I got up from my desk and I went to the store to get me some liquid refreshment. It was a soda and water. I didn't get anything other than that. And
I'm glad you cleared that up. Reverend. We were concerned about your liquid refreshment.
I was just thinking fruit of the vine. Fruit of the vine.
He was having communion by himself.
Right, man. And I was in line, right, to get my soda. And a lady said, hey, Mr. Wilson, Pastor Wilson, how you doing? I said, oh, fine. Then she went down to ask me about my son, who she coached in basketball, and she had been away for several years. And I said, oh, you don't know. And then, man, I'm up there, dropping the flood of the, Noah's Ark had to be in that place. And she, just because she didn't know. But then after talking with her, and then just, matter of fact, just Sunday at the book signing, one of my members said, Pastor, I did not know that's how you felt during your situation. I said, it's no different than how you feel during yours. And then they actually said, I'm not, Pastor, and then apologizing to me for not knowing, but it's very therapeutic, and I still sense myself still going through because I put my situation on pause. And so it really mask, cover up, bury it alive, and never dealt with it correctly. And so now the Lord has given opportunity to look at it, and the congregations doing a book signing and those who have read it, it has been overwhelmingly positive.
Yeah, to our listening audience, Pastor Wilson, he and his wife Shirley have two sons, Michael and Philip. Philip's the older of the two, and Michael, his youngest son, was tragically killed on a job site accident. And I can just remember when we got the news, it just kind of, took the wind out of all of us. So I like I said, most of us can only imagine what that feels like. Some though have experienced that. You're listening to Real World, Real Talk. I'm Dr. DZ Cofield, your host on your member-supported public radio station. And we're going to take a short break. We'll be back in just a moment to continue our discussion around the pastors whose stories were so deep they needed to write under a pseudonym. We'll be back in just a moment. Welcome back to Real World, Real Talk. I'm Dr. DZ Cofield, your host on this member-supported public radio station of what I hope has been an eye-opening show for you. We're talking about the new published and released book, The Pastor's Diaries. The Pastor's Diaries. If you'd like to get a copy of it, go to pastors, that's with an S, diaries.com, and you can get a copy of this book. Dr. Anderson, give our listening audience kind of the framework of the book in terms of the number of contributors and some of the subjects that you have your writers talk about in this work.
Well, it starts off with an introduction from myself on each chapter. Then I give my take of whatever the said subject is, followed by 4 other contributors to that actual chapter. And so we have 28 additional entries, and they're diary entries. Every entry starts with "Dear Diary." And we go into it, and I've asked each of the pastors to give 1,000 words in their treaty of that subject that they did. And so I have 4 others that's going. And so totally, with the total, it's 26 additional contributors with 28 contributions. Dr. Paul James have written 2 in there, and then we had 2 that needed to use pseudonyms for their chapters because they touched on something that had not been public as yet and needed to do that for the moment.
All right, so let's talk about that. For those of you who are listening, pseudonym simply means they wrote under a fake name. They wrote under AKA, kind of like they in witness protection. But their story was that revealing in terms of what they had gone through in their life, and they just didn't feel like people could handle it, and they have not disclosed it publicly up to this point, but they told their story in this book. Let's talk about the 2 that wrote under pseudonyms and the subject matter that they dealt with, because I think, a lot of times people don't know that pastors are just regular people, man, who are struggling and fighting, and many of us have learned how to compartmentalize our pain. We've learned how we have high thresholds for pain. Sometimes we just know how to cover things up. But I was really interested in the story of those 2 that wrote under the pseudonym.
Well, yeah, the one wrote under pseudonym to protect his children. He was dealing with a very messy divorce. And so he used a pseudonym in order to protect his children. He did not want to speak a certain way about their mother, but yet he wanted to be transparent about it, because one of the things that we know as pastors, divorce is like the unforgivable sin. You can commit murder, you can be a former drug addict, you can go to jail. I mean, you can do everything except get divorced and then pastor. And so to be able to come back, and he's in a perseverance chapter, to be able to come back from something like that is significant. But to talk about remaining and trying to remain in that place because of everything you've studied, and your whole life is based on ministry, and a divorce discredits you from the very thing you've been called to do. And so how that whole process took place and went down and experienced. And then again, just the grace of the Lord that gave this individual a chance to continue to do ministry after that. The other one is a pastor who's been married for over 40, 50 years, but had a homosexual relationship, was violated at a young age, and experienced that type of love, did not have love from his father, actually was attracted to older men and behaved in that way until he was saved and delivered from that, and able to step away and have a healthy life and a healthy marriage I thought it was important, specifically in our day and time, to give some people hope that, that, yeah, you can actually have that relationship. It's so big right now of what do you identify as?
Sure.
And the reality is, who do you identify with? Who do you identify in? Not who do you identify as. And so when you make that transition, I think it's good for the body to know that we don't just give up on homosexuals. There's hope. That for some, that's the leper. But for us, it's just sin. And it's not too big for our Lord. And I felt that needed to be not only handled, but handled well, and handled from someone to be like, not only were they living in this lifestyle, but to come be delivered from that and be able to pastor. And so that person, when this book began, had not made that public. This is just becoming public. This person has now disclosed that to their wife. They are treating people and serving people individually, but they're about to go very public with their past very soon at a chapel. And so the pseudonym will be revealed at some point. But at this point, it's been just a blessing to have those contributions. And I wanted them in there, even if they couldn't use their name. I felt those stories needed to be shared.
Yeah. So let's deal with the first one, and then I'll come back to the second one. I think, you're right, especially in the white evangelical community. Divorce has been perceived as the unforgivable sin, right? To your point, it doesn't matter what else you do. You can do anything else, but man, if you are divorced, it doesn't matter. Unbiblical reasons, it doesn't matter. I know Ricky and I, when we were at Dallas Seminary, we saw people lose their jobs, and I don't want to be graphic, but they lost their jobs for looking at pornography. Like they didn't even fool with a woman. They didn't, and some of us were like, and y'all, I'm for our listening audience, I'm from the projects, and I'm still a project, okay? But we were literally like, he didn't get none, and y'all fired him. Like he looked at the screen. We were like, what? Like there was no redemption. Like we can't pray through this or nothing, And so you get to divorce, man. You're damaged, man, and I know, for myself personally, having been through that and went through a major period of depression, serving while I was depressed. And, I've shared with, my congregation, man, and people, man, I mean, I would cry like all night Friday and all day Saturday in terror of Sunday, and would preach Sunday. And the Lord would bless, man. People give their life to the Lord, and then I cry all night Sunday night, and people had no idea what I was dealing with for years, and just kind of found my way out by the grace of God. Didn't know I was drowning in depression until my feet hit the ground and I was coming out. And people like Ricky and Pastor Willie Richardson, who we've talked about, man, was so gracious and so loving and so encouraging, that it gave me space to heal. And I would tell people all the time, man, there's enough blame to go around. Like I'm not blaming anybody. Paul James, you remind me of my first church, man. I tell people all the time, my preaching gifts were far ahead of my pastoral maturity. And and I tell people all the time, the difference between my first church and Good Hope, which is my fourth church, is not the people, it's the pastor. And if I could go back, man, I'd serve for free, just to thank them for the education that they gave me. This issue about the homosexuality, I think, is very, very interesting, because a lot of times when we think about the LGBTQIA plus community, we tend to think of them as almost monolithic, that they're almost this, for lack of a better term, this homogeneous group, and everybody got to their stationed the same way and on the same path. And when you talk about somebody who has been molested, somebody who's been assaulted, you know, and that's how they receive that love, whether they're men or women, and to see somebody who recognizes that their behavior was not rooted in nature, it was rooted in nurture or the lack thereof. And to be able to recognize that and to be able to claim his healing and deliverance. And I'm not here one way or another to say, you know, what somebody should do or shouldn't do. But I think it's exciting and it's hopeful, as you said, Dr. Anderson, for that story to be told.
Right.
That this person was able to navigate their way out of it, find their way to a healthy place in terms of relationship, marriage, serving in ministry. And we certainly want to pray for their strength. As you all have read the book, Pastor Ricky Wilson and Pastor Paul James, tell us what stories resonated for you beyond your own story.
Yes, I would love to just say that if it were not for some of the persons that have existed in the LGBTQIA plus community, if it were not for some of those folk, churches, certainly Black churches, would be very silent. We wouldn't have no music.
Yeah.
If we only had straight music,
right.
straight gospel artists.
Yeah.
It's just kind of ironic. And with Black folk are more gracious concerning the issue of homosexuality. But, you know, it's more don't ask, don't tell, you know. But that has been a staple in our community. So it's kind of, so I'm just overwhelmed with, what would I say? A sense of joy, a sense of admiration for this pastor that came forward and said that under the pseudonym. But one of the things that stuck out to me, the women stuck out to me. There were women contributors, and to hear their story as to where is my place. And the way the women wrote was with such humor and such humility and such authenticity. One of them came to your town where you shepherd, Dr. Cofield, in Houston. It's just tremendous to read the stories of women. And I think it shows the bandwidth of Dr. Anderson. Dr. Anderson moves in a lot of circles that don't particularly affirm women in ministry.
Right.
And I think he took a transcendent perspective, not to adjudicate his own position on the issue, but the reality is that we have women in ministry, and for him to have the foresight to allow them to tell their story. So I was very gripped by those two stories in particular. All of it. It's a wonderful book. It's a good book. I'm proud to be associated with it. And all of the contributors did a marvelous job, but I was particularly moved by the women because they have some challenges that, frankly, you know, I take for granted that I don't have. And although I hold the patriarchy accountable, and I'd like to think of myself as a progressive pastor that is not patriarchal in an unhealthy manner, I'm a part of the patriarchy. You know, it's just the way it is. I'm a part of the patriarchy. I am a patriarch by definition as a pastor. And so I was very humbled by those stories, even by the note of familiarity in them, that these women have come from very similar backgrounds of my own and had similar pains of which I related to.
Yeah. Pastor Wilson?
Yes, I was piggyback off of what Pastor Paul was talking about. I was intrigued when I heard and read about the one pastor who found himself needing to apologize to his congregation. Usually you get the picture that it's them against us. And for that took some serious humility and vulnerability, and said, I owe my congregation apology. And you know, because it seems like it's always them against us, when that is not the picture that the Lord wants to have. But to hear him to be open and honest about it. And then I was reading one where the preacher was talking about his pride And people assume that the pastors are arrogant and prideful, but for the preacher to come out and say about his pride, that in of itself was a humbling issue to just be that vulnerable about your own, full of yourself. And the danger in that, man, when you just full of yourself, nobody can talk to you. And sometimes even God has to remove us out of the place, because that pride is going to mess up the body of Christ. But to hear them just communicate and articulate about that, and then the ladies and everybody has their posture on it. But one of the things that helped me is that Cofield, and some of the old guards, man, you just don't you just don't listen to a woman if she's holding that pastor role. And the Lord has given me a whole new perspective, coming from when Paul says, "Let no man judge another man's servant." That's not my call. That's between her and the Lord. Into seeing the journey, and do you see me, and where do I fit? I heard a sermon. Now, if you're from DTS, DTS will just chop up an expository message. But one preacher, I ain't gonna mention his name, preached a sermon, Women in Ministry. And the sermon that he preached was when after the crucifixion of Christ, and it was the women that cared for his body, tended his body, and he was using that as women in ministry. And I knew he was stretching it, but I was just honing in for myself, hearing our sister stories and having an appreciation for the courage that they are demonstrating to do ministry where they are in the homeland, Africa. And when we have been there, we've done ministry there, and a number of the pastors were women, and they became the pastors because their husbands, who were pastors, died, and only people were left were women and children. And so they had to take on the role of pastoring. So I have a whole new appreciation for the work and the struggle. So in hearing people's stories is very helpful for me to say, wow. And it just motivates me now to pray for the people by name. And I'm just hoping not too many of the pastors are going to retire right away after they shared their stories, but they'll hang in there for a little while longer and see the other side of this.
Yeah. I tell you what's interesting about that whole discussion around pride. I can remember looking at pastors, for example, in my specific context, who were getting divorced, some 1, 2, some 3. I remember when I came to Good Hope, there was a minister here who had been married 5 times, and he told me that nobody could ever tell him anything about a woman. He knew about women. And I said, brother, obviously nobody's told you anything about women or taught you anything if you've been married 5 times and the one you with now is not your wife, right? But I can remember saying to myself, I would never let that happen. I would never be in that situation. And after 15 years in counseling and a variety of things happening, I found myself in a position that I never found myself in. And I remember praying and asking God to forgive me. And I felt unworthy to preach the gospel, felt unworthy to share. And it was amazing because I can remember praying that and feeling God say to me very clearly in my spirit, "You mean you just felt unworthy?" It's like, you've been missing something, bro. Like you've never been worthy. Even at your best, you were unworthy. And it was such an humbling experience to come face to face with my own mortality, come face to face with my own sin nature, come face to face with my own failures. And what I hear you all saying is that, this book is the kind of tool that can help you get over your Elijah complex, that you're the only one out here dealing with this, that there are other brothers and sisters who are dealing with this, and how we can pray for and encourage one another and get beyond, Dr. Anderson, as you talked about earlier, the competition that exists in many of our churches between one congregation and another, and to recognize that we're all struggling in one way or another. As we get ready to close our segment today, Dr. Anderson, what are some final thoughts you want to say? And for those of you who may be just tuning in, you're listening to Real World, Real Talk. We're talking to 3 of the contributors to the book, The Pastor's Diary, The Pastor's Diary. And you can go to PASTORSDIARIES.com, pastorsdiaries.com, and order a copy of this story. It's not an expose. It's literally just pastors just peeling back the curtain on their lives, opening up their hearts and sharing their struggles, what they were going through. And many of you who are listening, who are members of a congregation, it's important for you to get this, because, man, while you sitting there talking about, my pastor didn't come visit me, my pastor didn't do this, my pastor didn't do this, many times we fail to pray for and recognize the humanity of our own spiritual leaders. Pastor Anderson, but before me asking you about Pastor's Diaries Volume 2, because I know somebody's already asked you, man. I'm volunteering, brother, to be in Volume 2. But what are some final thoughts that you want to share with our listening audience?
Well, there's 7 chapters in this book. It's a chapter on pressure, on pain, on power, on pride, on the pedestal, on perseverance, and on passion beyond a pulpit. And it's 7 chapters, 7 topics that we wrestle with as pastors. And I think it's important for us to understand that it's real, that spiritual depression is real, that we need healthy pathways and friends in order to have healthy ministries and to finish well. The Bible is not silent on depression. When you look at the Psalms, you look at these cry outs, why, my soul, are you downcast, and why so disturbed within me? We may not call it depression when we read these things, but there's a lot of pain. There's a lot of victimization of being attacked and being isolated. And as you talked about, the Elijah complex of being alone. And we need to know that we need to have these healthy discussions. And I'm hoping that this book will birth some real healthy cohorts of discussions, that friendships will evolve, that relationships can be healed within the body. There's so many that talk about being hurt within the body of Christ, but I don't think nobody understands. No one is hurt more than those who stand behind that sacred desk. And so to understand that, to affirm that, to recognize that, and then to do the things that's needed to help us be healthy and finish well. Because we all want to hear, well done, my good and faithful servant. We all want to hear that. And so that would be my hope.
I appreciate it, man. Thank you, brother, so much for being with me on today on Real World, Real Talk. The late Vernon John said, if you see a good fight, get in it. And I add, if you don't see a good fight, start one. And the fight for your well-being spiritually is a fight you definitely want to engage in. But here's the thing, and we talk about it on the physical side when we talk about, for example, caring for our first responders. We want to celebrate our police officers. We want to celebrate our firefighters. We want to celebrate those frontline medical workers, and we should. But listen to me carefully. We should also celebrate and encourage and pray for our frontline spiritual workers as well. I want to encourage you in Pastor's Appreciation Month, show your pastor some love. I mean, some real love. For somebody, it may be a hug. For somebody, it's a kind word. For somebody, it's a card. For somebody, it's a material blessing. But whatever it is, man, show that love. I'm going to tell you something that your pastor probably hasn't told you. I've been pastoring the Good Hope Church for 28 years. I've been pastoring since 1984. And here's what's interesting. I will have people come to me periodically, and I believe it's providential, who will say to me, Pastor, I know you hear it all the time, but man, I was so blessed by that message. Or Pastor, I know you hear it all the time, but God, boy, you just touched me today. And I started saying to people, you know what? I don't hear it all the time. Thank you for sharing that. Because the truth of the matter is, while we assume that our pastors know, they really don't know. So I want to encourage you to be a source of encouragement for your pastor, for your staff pastors, for your ministers. Encourage them in the Lord and let them know how much of a blessing they have been in your life. All right. This is Dr. DZ Cofield for Real World, Real Talk, signing off. You're listening to your member-supported public radio station, your number one source for news and public affairs. Until next time, God bless is my prayer.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Real World, Real Talk. Be sure to subscribe to this podcast to be notified of new episodes every week. Follow us via social media using the @RWRTDZ username on all platforms: YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. To submit any comments, questions, sponsor opportunities, or future show suggestions, visit us online at rwrtdz.com or via email at info@rwrtdz.com. Thank you for listening, and we hope you've been inspired to be the change you want to see in the world today. Until next time, be real, keep it real, and stay real.